Yeah,
there we go.
And Cindy's gonna get a camera.
Sorry for the delay, everyone. We're getting ready.
Yeah,
We're excited to be here.
Are we on? She on? Okay. All right, bye.
Have a seat.
I'm going to go out to the little side door.
Fine, that's cool. Thank you, everyone, for being so patient with us. We were just trying, we have some technical difficulties trying to get on to our live page, but we are excited to be here today with you. We have so much we want to talk about, and I've been getting little private messages about what's going on today. So thank you so much for your patience, and thank you for logging in and hearing more about what we have to say. Okay, so hi, everyone. Welcome back. This is the second part of a series that we've been working on. It's called Overcoming Betrayal and Exclusion, Building Inclusion and Respectful Partnerships. Today we're going to focus on Ain't I a Woman? Can I have this book right there? We're going to introduce ourselves in a minute. So we're focusing on this. I did not know that this book is also translated in different languages. I had people sending me messages about, a particular quote from the book. So it's very exciting to see how many people are involved and, really want to know about this more. So, the author is Bell Hooks. And we'll dive in a little bit more. We're going to introduce ourselves. I'm Cindy Suasso.
And I'm Lynn Brodsky. And off camera,
Patty Shepard.
Patty Shepard.
And at the other end of typing fingers
is Chioma, who's the Vice President of Eastern Region of Massachusetts Women Coalition. We're working together along with the League of Women Voters from Winchester. You want to talk about how this conversation started so we can get a little bit sense of, I know we talked about it last time, but I think we can reboost a little bit about what.
So MAWOCC has done some collaborations with different aspects of League of Women Voters in Massachusetts, and it came about with our particular chapter because we wanted to look at our title really reflects what we want to do. There's a history of betrayal and exclusion by white women's groups as regards to black women's groups. And so there are many black women that advocated through history for women's suffrage and women's rights and working people's rights and poor people's rights, but they don't appear in the so-called mainstream media. And so we want to try to bring the history forward and establish reconciliation. You can imagine that there's been a certain amount of anger around these acts of racism. So we want to promote inclusion and partnership and conversation and collaboration going forward.
So I want to invite anyone who wants to send messages or just make comments on the page. We are more than willing to answer some of the questions, but we're going to go through some quotes from the book first, just so you can get a sense of what the book is about and why we need to have this conversation. I think this conversation is it's like a pot brewing and waiting to happen. So this is the brewing that's happening. So I want you to stay tuned and just be open. This is open dialogue that I think a lot of us have been waiting for it to happen. And this is how we start. So thank you for tuning in.
So this book is a remarkable book written by Bell Hooks when she was only 19 years old. She's from a rural area of Kentucky, and she said that she grew up in a very paternalistic household and really didn't like the way her father treated the rest of the family. So she was investigating feminism on her own. And I've actually read about a number of books about racism, and only one of these books, which is a book by Dana Barry called The Price of Their Pound of Flesh, mentions anything about how women and men were treated differently during slavery. And so what Bell Hooks is trying to do is reverse the sort of defaults where when scholars are talking about women, they're talking about white women, or when scholars are talking about black people, they're talking generally about black men. So actually very little has been written about black women. So, and this book, Bell Hooks, is really the first book to start to look into the history of black women. She covers the whole arc of history of black women from slavery times until 1981, which is when the book was published, and her later books cover things after that. But so it's a really excellent book. I can't say enough about it. I learned a lot from it.
We're learning more. So can we talk about the first quote and see so see if people have questions about the first quote we're going to discuss?
Okay, so the first quote, shall I read it?
Yeah.
So the first quote back to the default says that white women are given grant money to do research on black women, but I have never found any instance where black women have received funds to do research on white women's history. And this is, mind you, that Bell Hooks had done this research at the age of 19 and discovered that. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think that one of the things that I was doing as we were getting ready for this topic, I did a little bit of research to try to figure out a little bit more. And there was a woman named Monica Williams who's a PhD who does like research on diversity and inclusion, just in general, just industries, but particularly in education. And one of the things she's talked about, and I'm quoting her, is saying, white feminists exist to promote the comfort and safety of middle class and affluent white women. Now, from perspective of women of color, I think we kind of feel that, but a discussion about that has never really happened. And I think that this is a great time for us to like talk about, where are we in that picture? Because we do feel isolated. There's not to say that we haven't grown in industries, but we don't feel like it's still not equal, and it's still not equal for women. So if we look at it from that perspective, it's still not equal for women, and then it's not equal for the women of color. So we have to look at that first and try to figure out what are we doing, and it has to do with law and everything else. But we're not going to discuss all those minor details. But we should be talking from a perspective for ourselves as a community members and how that impacts us. I know for myself, it impacts me on a daily basis. And I think it has to do with, because I know how to access more resources than probably many of my community members, but I'm always bringing my community members with me. And I often say, I'm coming in here, but I'm also coming in with everyone else who could not come to this space. And I think for a lot of women, especially women of color, we often feel that. We often are trying to project that. We want to make sure that we stepped in here, and anyone else that comes behind us can also have that space. But I don't think that's the same perspective for other groups. But we're always in that mindset. We're going in here, we're going to present. We want to make sure that they think of us as an equal. But you get questions. Are you really that equal? And I think that's where the divide is. That we're often, women of color are also looking for themselves, but they're also looking for their community. And I think from a perspective, and I don't know how you feel, but that's as I talk to more women, especially women of color, that's the mindset that we go into all the time. So I don't know if it's different for white women, but I know women of color, we're always thinking about that.
Well, yeah, and that was sort of what stimulated this choice of an author, was that there's different language between white women's feminism and black women's feminism. This book is the first feminist book of any kind I ever read. I had all kinds of advantages and got to a position of high level of scholarship and affluence, probably partially because of being white. And never thought about feminism, that if my being female held me back, I didn't notice it. So I'm reading this book, and so she talks about the history of feminism, even back to the suffrage, before women got the vote. And so women were fighting for women, but what white women were, but what they were really looking for is to be the same as the men, to occupy some of the same positions, to get the vote. As soon as it became clear in the 19th century that black people were going to get the vote, that translated to black men, and the white suffragists of the 19th century, who many of whom had been abolitionists, suddenly lost their interest in racism because in correcting racism, because they thought that was going to take away from their advancement to being equal to the men. Similarly, in the 1970s, when 20th century feminism was very popular and women's studies departments were forming, she was coming up as a scholar, and said that these women had no interest in race. And when black women brought up and said, we're not really interested in getting positions in the boardroom, we just want to get basic standard of living for our families and basic entry into education, housing, it's not that we want to, we have an option between being a housewife and working, or between being the secretary and being the president of the company. We don't have an option of not working. We're working because we have to, and working in terrible conditions, and we're still poor.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and our communities are poor, so it was very different. You know, and when the women of color and the black women tried to get the feminist establishment to take an interest in promoting communities of color and poor communities and making the landscape sort of more accessible to everyone, the white feminist groups just didn't want anything to do with it.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was reading as well is, if you guys get a chance, it just came out in July 2018. It's a title from the New York Times. It says, How the Suffrage Movement Betrayed Black Women, in particular. And it's by Brett Staples. And he goes into very detailed historically. And also, he referenced this book in particular. Because I think this is information that I think women like us really know that it always existed, but having an outline and having someone talk about it changes the narrative. And one of the things that he said in particular, and I think this is an open conversation for all of us to begin to talk, is that black women, most of whom lived in the South, were seeking the ballot for themselves and their men as a mean of empowering black communities. So we have to remember during that time, there's a lot of things going on. And, you know, women, I always say women, like the women of color are always thinking about the community aspect. We're always thinking about, you know, what's gonna be good for the community. And that's why I think we have the divide, because we're always thinking about the men in our community. We're always thinking about the children in our community. We're always thinking about what's going to be the impact of the community. And I think that's an idea that we have. We're not individualistic when we go into our spaces. We're always thinking about the space for all of us. And I guess we don't have the glory because we're still marginalized and we're still part of intersectionality, that we don't have the opportunity to say, oh, I'm just doing it for myself. We don't have that glory yet. I think, and that's a dialogue, a larger dialogue that we need to discuss, that we still don't have that. When we look at data in particular, we look at the workforce in particular, it continues to do that. And we'll talk more about data and workforces a little bit later, but it continues to marginalize women of color in particular. So that's one of the groundbreaking things we should discuss. And I don't know if anybody has any questions that they wanted to ask right now.
Well, we're getting a few people watching, and we got a wow from Michelle a few minutes ago. Celia's on the phone, and Tanya. But frankly, I'm afraid to touch this, so that's all. I'm afraid we'll have trouble again if I do something wrong. I'll try to monitor them as they seem to come up the screen as they come in. It's
not on your.
I haven't been able to find a chat anywhere.
So while we try to figure that out, I'm going to go over another topic.
Yeah.
Another quote from the book. It says, so Bell looks at social and economic and political forces, which we're going to dive in a little bit more, impacts of primary black women. She traces historical arc from slavery through the campaign of voting rights, the civil rights movements in the mid-19th century, women's liberation, and up to the time of the book was published in 1981. So think about 1900s to 1981. The position of black women has never been compared to that of white women. And we discussed that a little bit, how it's not been compared to the same way of the movements as of that of black men. As we said before, we're coming as a community all the time. We're coming from a community aspect of how to come together. So white women rights activists have not just been ignoring the specific concerns of black women, but they actively and intentionally exclude them. The intersectionality of how sexism and racism have impacted black women underlines the predominant historical themes laid out in this book. This is why this book is important for us to see. I think that when we look at, when they say in particular, you know, the positions that we hold now, I want to go over some little bit data, and it's by the women in the workplace, that there's often a disparity in the workplace. And, you know, as we know today, women of color are some of the most highly educated women, but we still don't see ourselves in certain positions. So in 2000, the 2018 report, because we're still in 2019, there was a report from the Women in the Workplace and Corporate Pipeline, and it shows a trajectory of from the entry-level position to the C-suite of many people. So it went over white men, men of color, white women, and women of color. And when we look at that, we have to consider intersectionality when we're talking about women of color, because that's when we begin to see another breakdown. So in particular, and we can post that. Probably Chioma's probably looking for that now.
Well,
so
somebody just said, "Hey, cheese," so that's probably hello to Chioma. But we want to welcome Brenda. She's on the call.
Thank you, Brenda, for being on. So when we look at this, you want to go over there with me? We look at, like, in entry level position, we have white men at 36%, men of color 16%, white women 31%, and women of color 17%. Now, as we move over the cross line, I'm not going to go over all the data, but when we go to the C-suites, we see white men at 68%, men of color at 9%, white women at 19%, and women of color at 4%. Oh, wow. So there's a disparity there.
Yeah.
I think that's what we're discussing. Like, we have these large disparities in our communities, and we're trying to figure out, what are things we need to do. I think Bell Hook is very intentional in the things that she's saying for us to begin this dialogue, to begin this conversation. I think that when you think about a young woman at 19 already is able to discuss this at this level, that tells you that how many years in her life that she has witnessed this type of, racism, sexism, disparities in her whole life, and how feminism for her is much different than probably her white female peer would have wrote.
Yeah, well, in 1981, the white female peer according to her, was just interested in getting into the C-suite, mm-hmm. but they weren't interested in that, 60% of whatever it is of women of color or poor people that were in entry-level jobs and couldn't progress. Very often, mm-hmm. the women were single because of other forces and had children, and they were working, full jobs, but it was not a liberatory path for them. It was just not even survival in some cases. So this notion of the white feminists talking about the sort of Betty Friedan model, mm-hmm. of, being liberated from being a housewife and being able to go to work. The black women and the poor people didn't have any choice. They're working because they had to, but the feminists in the Women's Studies Department didn't want to talk about it, and in fact actively, excluded some of these other people. Mm-hmm. It's interesting in Bell Hooks, in her later book, has a much more sort of global view of what feminism is, and it's very universal and it's very utopian, and it's totally different than this book, but that's for another conversation. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. She did go through that. One of the forces that sort of lead to these differential economic and social positions, she starts with the times of slavery and coming all the way up to essentially the present day. It was 40 years ago, but talking about how there were stereotypes and black women were devalued. And so you look at some of the movies we saw in the middle of the 20th century, where there were black male and female actors, mm-hmm. that appeared, but they would be occupying the roles of domestic or factory workers. The most famous, I think, is the Mammy character mm-hmm. in Gone mm-hmm. with the Wind. In 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a senator, I believe from New York, right, who published this report called The Negro Family, the Case for National Action. He argued the black American family was being undermined by female dominance, and he created this stereotype called the matriarch that was supposedly emasculating the men. Mm-hmm. Well, if you think of what's a matriarch is the ruler of her family, the ruler maybe of her community. She's wealthy, she's physically and financially secure. Black women were none of those things. Mm-hmm. This was just a stereotype that was created. And finally, we're very familiar with the so-called angry black woman stereotype. That's just a way to demonize one portion of our population. So we've seen sometimes when a black young man has been shot by the police, they show the mom on TV being angry, because that's a meme mm-hmm. that people can relate to, but they don't show her crying with her family. They don't show her grieving at home, staring out the window. They don't show the church service with the whole community coming together. They just show her being angry. And finally, I think all of us are very familiar with the recent example of 4 congressional representatives who are women of color and have been told that they don't love their country and that they should go back where mm-hmm. they come from. That is a direct appeal to the angry black woman stereotype. So these stereotypes of devaluing women of color are still in use today. And I think, if they're going for interviews for a promotion, even unconsciously, if the person doing the hiring, has a person of color and a person not of color, even if they think they're not racist and they're not purposely, those cultural stereotypes are going to be in their mind and affect whatever decisions they make.
And I'm glad you mentioned that the cultural stereotype stays in someone's mind, because I'm always conscious of that no matter where I go.
Yeah.
I'm always conscious that that's what they're thinking about me as I walk into the door.
Can you share any personal examples that you've experienced?
Yeah,
recently?
so recently I had an experience with my son, who's only 11 years old, at his school, and it was just the worst. And they were accusing him of he was comforting a girl who was crying, and and then he ran because he didn't want to miss his bus. But as I received the call from the school, it was a whole, like, he was sexually touching. I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't. Let me try to figure out what's going on. And these are the type of things. And if I was to go with what the school told me, imagine between June, we're in the month of August. Imagine how he would feel now. So these are the kind of things mothers, especially mothers of color, have often had to do with their children. Preparing them at a young age. This is why I'm not surprised she wrote that at 19. Yeah. Preparing them at a young age to tell them what this world's going to expect from you. Mm-hmm. And why you have to just walk on a straight line, don't look at them, and just keep walking, because I don't want them to accuse you of anything that I know you're not part of. So these are the kind of things that I think that, that we experience and other groups do not experience. And we're often trying to manage, what the society is thinking of us. But the problem is that we're at a stage in this society that we had the civil rights movement, we have the suffrage movement, we have all these movements to say that we don't no longer want to deal with that. We want to deal with inclusion and equity and diversity and not being marginalized, not feeling intersectionality when we walk into we just don't want it. And I think that Bell Hook is pushing that. She's pushing that for us to have this conversation. She's pushing that for companies, for industries to begin to think about, these topics in particular. Because I know for myself, and I know colleagues of mine as well, they often tell me stories that we only share amongst ourselves, because we don't ever think that someone's going to understand our story. Mm-hmm. But I understand the story because I live it as well. But these stories are so touching at times, and I think that if somebody has time, if they can have a conversation and just begin this conversation, because I think the only way to dismiss some of these actions is the conversation. And I'm so happy that the league has partnered with MAWOCC to begin to open up this dialogue and open this conversation, because I think this is where we begin the healing process. This is when we begin to see things that are happening and address it in a different way. I don't think we addressed it in a way that we should. And I think this is our opportunity to begin to address things that should be happening. Oh.
So, and also I want to open it up to welcome Carol, guess it's Krosky, I'm not sure, and Jean Morrison has joined us most recently.
Jean.
So we've got some great folks on the live feed.
Thank you. So I'm going to read another example from the book to get you, revved up and begin to think more about this feminist movement and how we can be, a little bit more inclusive and, begin to that diversity piece of being inclusive of all of us. So the feminist leader drew comparisons between women and Black people. So think about that. When you think of women, you think about everyone's inclusive in that group. But in reality, it's not all of us together. So when we think about women and Black people, we think about women. So who are those women? And Black people is another group. So that is already a disparity right there. So we need to begin to think about this. This is not meant to improve the status of Black people, but rather an appropriation of the Black experience to draw attention to themselves. So we're trying to, I'm doing this like a teacher. We're trying to draw this.
You are a teacher. You are a teacher.
So we're drawing the experience of what that is. So we're talking about the women's experience, the Black people's experience, and drawing that attention. So what is that attention? I think that's the conversation we're having. What is that attention that we're trying to grab? Which in the 19th century meant the lack of suffrage. So we were talking about the suffrage movement. The suffrage movement, what is that? Who did that include? What are we trying to do? And earlier, I made a quote for when I talked about what the Black women were seeking and what the white women were seeking in the suffrage movement. And they had two different ideas of what they were trying to do. And Lynn just spoke about, in colleges, they were focused on the women's movement, but that was still exclusive of other people. So the mid-20th century meant unequal access to lucrative and powerful employment as an incomplete control of their own bodies. So we talked about industries and how industries has impacted the 20th century, and we wanted people to go into industry, and we learned about this, especially during the wartime, how more women started working, and they became part of the workforce, and that totally changed the environment as well. So I want to stop there for a little bit because I want to see what people think about what that is, and paying attention in particular to what those two things are. So when we look at the women's movement and the feminist movement, we only think of women, but we don't look at the different faces of the women in our movement. And I think that's where we are trying to break the ice and trying to say, we're chopping up this. It's not just one slice. We need to add more people in there. Other voices need to be there. What is there? What are they bringing? What do they bring to the table? How we can include them? Because often, a lot of us women of color feel like we need to be, I would say, whitewashed to be able to participate instead of coming in as ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think that often we cannot come in as ourselves. We have to come with a different lingo. We have to be able to talk a different way. We have to have, all this education behind us, just to be able to be part, to say that, oh, well, it's okay. They have this. They can be part of us. But we're also fighting for people who do not have those positions. And I think as we look at this more and more as a community, we're trying to figure out how can we be an inclusive community with all the things that we have. We're trying to become a society that understands why we have so much violence in our communities. How is it set up? It's not purposely done. I always say drugs are not grown in those communities. Crime it doesn't happen because of the poverty that's happening. All those things, these things are purposeful, and we're trying to dismantle that in a way that begins the conversation. The conversation starts here, and the conversation starts with people responding. The conversation starts after this when people come together and begin to have the dialogue. So I think that's what we're here today to do. We begin to have this conversation because I know that I'm a little frustrated inside. And I have children that are growing up in a society, and I still think to myself that the society is still not producing in a way that provides diversity, that provides equity in all communities, and provides things that we need to be that way in the community. So this is where I fight with myself and say, oh, she has an afro, she must be militant. Oh, she has her natural, she must be very angry about wearing products. But I mean, that's not even the case. I think that we all come in different shapes and sizes, and we all just want to participate with each other. And we do have angry people. I mean, I get angry too, but I think that the labels that we connect with people is part of the stereotyping that you talked about earlier that we're often feeling. Like if I raise my voice in that area, it's like, oh, she's very, very angry. But sometimes it's not anger. I think it's anger out of frustration of what society has labeled me as already. Label me from walking into a room. If I wear my loud yellow colors, it's already a label of who I am. So we're trying to change that.
I got a great question here from Michelle. How do we educate or get white women to use their privilege when in power to help women of color and give the same oops or help as they would their counterparts? So that's a little bit off your topic, but in a way it's right on topic. So I wanted to make sure we got
it's the whole
this
thing
from
of
Michelle.
the
Yeah.
program.
Right, because so I think that's kind of the bottom line of all of this, is that that's what needs to happen. But
yeah, I mean, what Bell Hooks talks about this, there's one quote towards the end of this book. She skips from history to her own experience, and she says, "We were disappointed and disillusioned when we discovered white women in the movement had little knowledge of or concern for the problems of lower class and poor women, or the particular problems of non-white women from all classes." And then they wondered, why aren't non-white women participating in the movement in the first place? Because their issues weren't being addressed. And so in the end of this book, and in a later book that was written by the same author, she kind of answers that question. And she talks about reformist versus revolutionary feminism. And reforms means, white women, they get a job in the boardroom and they're promoted to sit next to, their husband or their brother-in-law. And they don't care about anybody else. They've achieved what they want. It's very self-centered version of feminism. It's not really feminism. But then revolutionary feminism is, how can we stand back and look at how society is structured? And there are these isms. There's patriarchy and classism and racism and capitalism. And all of those isms are quite exploitative and there's always a dominant group and always a group that's exploited. And she said that that's what revolution is she's not saying we should topple the government and destroy society, but we need to start working to recognize these forces in society that diminish humans and to change it. And she's an optimist, clearly, from reading this other book, believes that it'll happen someday, but it won't happen anytime soon. And I know, at least for me, as a white woman, my first really consciousness raising when I said I am going to start reading about this issue and immersing myself in it is when I heard an interview with Claudia Rankin on NPR. And she was reading from her book Citizen about microaggressions, and that was also the first time I'd heard that term. And I heard these stories, and they were so egregious, and I said, oh my God, I'll bet you money that I have done something like that sometime. Pretty good chance I have. Not intending to do harm, but nonetheless, harm was done. So then I started reading everything I could get on it, and it's been a few years. And so I think, there's this process you hear about called getting woke, and a lot of us think we're woke and we're not, but it's a process, and you got to just keep, reading and learning and educating ourselves. And then, I feel really fortunate that I've been able to have this opportunity to talk to you and other women in MAWOCC and start to have a conversation and learn about your point of view and your experience, and thinking about what I can do to change. I sometimes find myself having conversations in white spaces, and I'll say something, and the person I'm talking to is like, what?
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, we were mentioning. You got another question?
Well, I got another good answer if you're getting there.
Yeah.
So this is from Bevern. I'm not sure I pronounced it right, hon. She was one of the earliest people on the call, but the thing disappeared. So she says the real issue is to get white women to understand that they have to stop maintaining the patriarchy. We have to quit sort of colluding and making that work. Now, those are my words. And she almost come in with another question first. Or a comment, I guess. First, we as black women need to stop apologizing and explaining. I think white women need to put in the work. What does that mean? Do your homework. Lynn, thank you for doing your homework and then it's disappeared again. Now we've got Lawrence saying we have Democratic presidential candidates advocating free college. Are they on the right track, or is it something else, or is something else more important?
What do you think about that?
I'm the one.
Lawrence, I know who that is. I know who that is.
So, I think that for advocacy purposes, I think that, tuition free is what it would help the inequities for students who can't afford to pay for loans be able to go to school. I think that, we're off. This is another piece that I believe is it's the economic marginalization. When you have so many poor students going to school and not graduating, having loans to pay, I think that doesn't put them on the path of prosperity. I'm not saying everyone should go to college. I mean, you have your choice. But the ones who do decide to go to school, decide to go on to higher education, we should have opportunity for those, for people who, especially at the affordability level, be able to go, because that when you leave school with high debt, and I'm going to go into college a little bit, but when you leave school with high debt, your career opportunities is better, but you're so forced to pay back your loans that you will go for any career. So that's the stunt. And another thing I have to say is that the reason why I think these things are important, tuition free, is because a lot of students who have to work and go to school don't get the internships that they need to advance in their careers because they have to worry about paying for school. So these are the kind of things that I think that when they talk about tuition free, it kind of alleviates that, especially for low income students who get stuck with that. We want to be able to be a society where if you decide that you want to go to college, that this is here for you, and support them in a way so that they are able to have retention and transition to the next step at school. So I do believe that that's a way of that's a part of disparities and inequalities that we can focus on as well when it comes to free tuition. So thank you for answering that question.
I mean, I think we got to also start at a younger age. We hear about the school to prison pipeline, and I just, I'm glad that the principal or whoever it was with your little boy had enough sense to call you and ask you what was going on, but I just dread to think what would happen if he had been 16 or 17 and was just being nice to his classmate. But you hear about all these kids that they're now resource officers in school where, what might have been an argument or a schoolyard brawl between kids turns into criminal activity, and being a kid, especially being a boy or being a boy of color, gets criminalized. And so these kids are never going to get to the school that's got free tuition because they get diverted into the criminal pipeline, and that's pretty much the end of things for them.
Yeah, I agree. So part of one of the quotes that I read earlier was that the women are also often thinking about the means of empowering Black communities. So we're often thinking about how do we empower with the little resources that we have, and I had a colleague one day mention something to me, and I was like, wow, you guys have all these counselors and everything in your school system. Wow, that's so awesome. I said, but the parents that you're referring to are coming to my neighborhood, so I guess you're just kicking them out and sending them somewhere else so that the children don't get to see, but our kids get to see whatever's going on now. So that has changed. That's part of the changing dynamics. I think that we work with so little resources in our community, and I think resources are the key to anything that you want to do. But we work with so little resources that we're trying our best. Like, even though we have to work like so many hours and trying to manage our families, try to manage the community, manage the little that we can, we don't have the opportunity. And I think that the resources that we're lacking, I think that when one of the other earlier questions was how they can be supported, it was like the resources. The resources you have in your community, we should also have in our community. And that's the way you begin to find, but with cultural sensitivity as well. I think those are the two things. We should have the same resources, but with cultural sensitivity, that the community can manage those. And I think that's where we begin to have the same level of work.
And just going back to the focus on education, Chioma just made the very important point that it's a step in the right direction to help with college, but it starts in elementary school.
Yeah.
So.
And also starts at
starts in preschool.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It starts in
with
early
prenatal
education.
care.
Yeah, prenatal care.
Yeah.
So it starts with all. I think Bell Hook probably mentioned something about health.
I think in this book she doesn't get into it that much in this book.
It might have been something else.
Because I think there probably wasn't as much data about the health disparities in this book at that time when it was written.
And I think that often in our communities, going to the doctor is a whole thing. So we have to begin to be thinking about going to the clinic. What does that mean? I know growing up I used to see a lot of things because my mom was a nurse and I got to see a lot of different. I was exposed to a little bit more than I think my but I would see things. I was like, wow, that doesn't make any sense. Oh, but but when I was talking to my white girlfriends, they would already have access to these things, and I was like, wow, what a big difference. I wonder if they would have it. And this is me thinking as a young person, very young. Before I was 18, thinking about, why do they have this and we don't have this? Why do they have that and we don't have this? why did I have this in the school? We don't have this. And I would think about like, wow, there's really some like inequities here. And I just couldn't really pin myself to figure out what it was at the time. But I did realize there was some big inequities, especially when it came to education.
So, welcome to Patience. She's apparently joined the party here, and she says it's a great discussion. I just want to check in because it's almost 5 o'clock. Can we decide if we're going to run over? I know some people may have to leave the call, but are people open to running over till 5:15?
Well, I just want to make one announcement.
Just so we don't abruptly stop on everybody.
I want to make one. I want to thank people who are participating in this event. There was a competing event. There is this beginning at 5. So we're not going to be going to that, and it's the Jewish community of Greater Boston is having a demonstration or a prayer vigil really in front of the JFK Federal Building in support of immigrants. So if I wasn't here, I would be there, and I thank all the people that are here instead of there. I'm sorry you have to miss that event, but thank you for being here.
Thank you, everybody.
Right. And there was a comment, and I can't see who it was from, about the idea that white women could not just get themselves educated, but then work on helping to educate other white people. Very good point.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that's the beginning of the conversation. I think, this conversation is a really tough conversation, and I think a lot of us don't want to deal with it. And it's for many reasons. Because as women, we're still marginalized as a group. And I think that's the toughest part. We're all trying to get our little pieces in. We're like, oh, we barely have this. We need to work on this. We barely have it. We're still trying to work. So so the forces are like, how do we come together? When you look at your groups, you say, your community groups or all different groups, is it diverse enough? Does it have people of different ages? Does it have, young people? Does it have, people from LGBT? Does it have, so all those things we have to begin to think about when we look at just the groupings that we're part of, community groups, nonprofit groups, board groups, civic engagement groups, all those groups, is it really inclusive? So I think that's where you begin to really have the conversation and look around you and say, are we just going with one ideology or are we including everyone? And I think as we move forward, this is going to be the larger conversation that we're going to start to have.
I have seen one thing that I've
Are we going to 5:15?
I think we might be done, but we want to just have a little.
All right. Well, let's just make sure we get a couple more. There's one more question in here. If anybody wants to take it, it's from Lawrence, which says that the book was written 38 years ago. If Bell Hooks wrote it today, would she say anything different?
Yes. So I'm not sure when you tuned in, but she's written numerous books for adults and children. And actually, to what we were talking about, the reason she writes to children in her later book, Feminism is for Everybody, she addresses this, and she has a much more utopian, optimistic view. She does believe that educating people in democratic, egalitarian principles must start with childhood, and that's the reason she's been writing children's books. So she does think that if we start with kids, we can change the culture, but we got to get rid of the patriarchy and the classism and the all the isms.
Okay.
Any closing thoughts?
Well, how about, I don't see anything here. How about some more wisdom from you wonderful women?
We're excited to begin to have these conversations more and more. I think this is the way to begin the dialogue. I think that, going to schools and going to communities and going to events and having this conversation is where we begin to the straight line that people follow is begin to find more wiggles and wiggle room in there. I think this is a way for us to begin that conversation. I think that often that, we feel siloed. I know I felt siloed for almost my whole life, not having to, just trying to figure out things like, oh, did I say the wrong thing? Did I do the wrong thing? Was I supposed to dress this way? Was I too loud? Was my clothes too loud? Those kind of things that, that other people don't have to think about in their space, but I often have to think about that in my space.
Yeah. Should I bring out the other book and show it?
Yes, we have another book here.
We have another book here. This book is an incredible book. It's called Thick by Tracy McMillan Cottom. And as I hear about so many other things, I heard about her on NPR. And she's a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. And she's written this book about various aspects of being a Black woman in our society. and how women are devalued and they're assumed to be stupid. This just, you know, I don't want to give a long speech about this book. This book is an incredible book, and it's about, you know, it's her experience as a black woman.
And I know a lot of you knows when you guys see the word thick, what does that mean? Because they're often referred to us as thick, and it's just a whole like thing behind that, and how, you know, especially young girls, especially developed young girls, this kind of reference that they often use. And, you know, these are kind of like things that we kind of like need to break away from, and try to find that dialogue so we can be able to talk more about these things. But I'm interested in that particular, because I think that this is the way we begin our next conversation.
Yeah.
Talking about that, and as you mentioned before, like the women who were in Congress, how they shaped up things. But you know something? Those are the conversations we have all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm glad it's at a national level, because these are the conversations we have in our kitchens. These are conversations we have when we're on the bus waiting. These are the conversations they have in their religious sectors, whatever. These are the conversations we have. And it's so good, I think, for myself to see, this is what we talk about anyway, that you're in Washington talking about it as well. I think for other people it's like a nuance, because they never really had that, you know, knowing like the pipeline to prison. Like we are already seeing that, but how do we avoid that? You know, talking about health disparities, talking about girls and empowering girls, and, you know, Joma hates the word empower, so you let me know what I should use, Joma. But you know, working with young boys and trying to support them. You know, these are the kind of things that we've always talked to this community, and I think galvanizing in a way, just electing these women of color is a big step. And I think that they're already going in with that already, because they already feel that. You know, they're already feeling that. So, you know, it's good to see the faces that look like us be there, because they already know what the disparities are walking in. They just know. So I'm not too worried about them being there, because I already know that their voices are part of that.
Well, Cindy, I've learned a lot from you today and from reading these books, and we want to thank everybody from tuning in. And this will be available later on the MAWOCC Facebook page. You can look at this as well as part 1 of this series, which is there, and there will be a part 3, we're hoping, in October. Yes. We haven't finalized the details, so thank you, everybody. And we love you, and we'll see you later.
Thank you, everyone. So don't forget October. We don't know what date, but it's October. It's coming up soon.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. All right. Yeah.